Hey guys, welcome back. The past 3 months we've worked on our most challenging cosplay project ever. I know, I always say this, but it seems like that with every project we are making, it's getting crazier. For tennocon 2024, Digital Extremes reached out to us again for an awesome collaboration. This time they asked us to bring one of their characters from the new update Warframe 1999 to life. Warframe is an award-winning co-op looter shooter and is available for free on all platforms, so make sure to check it out. You'll find the link in the video description. The character we had to bring into the real world is Arthur. He is the very first proto-frame and will play a major role in Warframe 1999. So, if you want to see how we made a full silicone suit, lean back and enjoy the video. Digital Extremes provided us the 3D models from the game, which is great as a base for this project. But video game characters have different proportions than real humans, and also we had to separate the whole model and alter some parts to make it possible to actually wear this as a cosplay. In total, we've had 3 months for this project, and Ralph spent the whole 3 months only working on the 3D models, just to give you an idea how much work goes into the 3D modeling. The first costume part we built were the shoes. They are small and the least scary part, crafting-wise. We bought some simple black slippers, a space shoe, and cut off the back of the sole. It was just way too big. We used a 3D scanner to get a 3D model of the shoe, and look how cool this turned out. This makes it so much easier to fit the 3D model perfectly to the shoe. We printed the front part of the shoe with our resin printer. The shoe is separated in 3 parts, and for the best movability, the big front part will be made out of silicone. Yes, even resin prints need some sanding and spray filling. Arthur's suit has textured and smooth areas. I did a few tests and found out that I can create the perfect texture with a thick layer of spray filler and a sponge. For preparing the 3D prints for molding, I use monster clay to separate the molds in 2 parts. As silicone, I use Rebound 40, which is a brush on silicone. To make sure the mold keeps its shape, I like to make my mold shells out of epoxy resin. The mold making process of both shoes took 4 days, and then it was time to open the mold and remove the 3D print. This looked very good, so I could go on with casting. I started to brush in the black areas and then did the light gray area. I did several coats until I had an even thickness. Then I put both mold parts together and added more silicone to the seam line to connect both halves. Now came the best part, demolding. Look how good these turned out. At this stage they were quite wobbly, but the shoe will help to keep the shape. I glued the silicone pieces onto the shoe with a special silicone glue. Next I added some shading and weathering. Nothing sticks to silicone except of silicone, so I basically painted with tinted and thinned down silicone. The top and the back piece of the shoe needed to be sanded and got a nice paint job. Then I just had to assemble all parts and the shoes were already done. The shoes turned out super comfy, which is great for long convention days. Next we did the legs. They were obviously the biggest part of the costume, and I had to make a giant mold. But first we printed a prototype to check the fit. Since we were super busy with the project, we had to outsource some stuff. The final print was done by Tiger Crafts. We sent the files over to her and she printed and sanded the legs for us. Honestly, I felt a little bit bad when I added texture to some areas of these perfectly sanded prints. Because the legs were so huge and I tried to hide the seam lines as good as possible in the design, I had to make a 3-part mold instead of only 2 parts. This means it took more time than I had originally planned for this. I made a brush on silicone mold and added these silicone stripes on top. They work as keys to make sure the silicone mold and the epoxy shell are kinda locked together. I will not go too much into mold making detail here. It's a complex process, and making the molds for both legs took me almost 2 weeks. And then came the moment of truth, opening the molds and see if they turned out good. Luckily, I had Ralph helping me with that. You definitely need some biceps power for that. Oh, look at them, 6 giant mold parts, and everything turned out so perfect. Time to mix up some silicone and start the silicone casting madness. I had to make both legs in one day. On that day I've worked 16 hours straight. That was tough, but I did it. On the next morning I could demold the legs. Again, a very nerve-wracking moment because you never know if you got some unwanted air bubbles. But everything looked good and I could trim the seam line. Before I paint my silicone pieces, I always have to clean them with soap and water to remove all the release spray leftovers from the casting process. I started with painting the red details and then added some shading and weathering to all the light areas. This is the armor piece, which was attached to the upper leg with a piece of Warbler and rivets. You can't just glue a big and heavy piece like this to the silicone, but attaching it from the back worked super great. The last step was to glue the silicone legs to a flexible pants. And then we were finally done. The shoes and the legs already looked so cool together. While I was doing all the crafting work, Ralph worked on the next 3D files. The printing and sanding process was again outsourced and I added the texture. The neck had to be a 3-part mold, so I did the separation with the clay and started to add the brush on silicone. I always apply 1 thin coat and then 3 to 4 thicker coats. The shell was again made out of epoxy resin and fiberglass cloth. I just went on doing each part of the mold. I think it took me about 6 days to make this mold, mostly because you have to wait until the layers are cured before you can go on with the next step. I could finally open the mold and I was happy how good it came out. Then the casting madness got me again. Luckily, this was a smaller piece, so it didn't take as long as the legs. Demolding these silicone casts is so satisfying. Well, as long everything turns out good, but I was very happy with the result. Now I only had to trim the edges and had to give the whole neck a good soap bath before painting. The red details on the neck piece were so tiny that a toothpick worked even better than a small brush. For a nice weathering effect, I sprayed on some silicone color and dabbed it with a paper towel to kinda get an uneven dirt pattern, if you know what I mean. I also added some shades here and there and added more silicone on top for an even shinier and stronger texture. These are the additional pieces for the neck. It's hard to get such a nice metallic finish with silicone. That's also one reason why some parts of the costume are silicone and some are resin prints. Lastly, we added the LEDs and then the neck was nearly done, only the jaw piece was missing. For the jaw we did so many prototypes to get the perfect fit for Ralph's face. The final piece was then printed with resin and got a nice metallic paint job. And then we were done. Look how cool this turned out, and it suits Ralph so well. It was time for the next big costume part, the torso. This was a quite huge piece, so we had to separate it into 8 pieces to fit it into our printer. All parts were glued together, and then came the most annoying part, sanding. Getting this huge print as smooth as possible, as fast as possible, we combined our power with our friend Tingelia Cosplay. She worked a few days on it and we did the finishing work. Again, some areas needed to be textured and then I could start with the molding preparations. Since the final costume part will be made out of silicone, it's extremely important where you separate your molds. This is where you will later have your seam line, and you want to hide the seam line as good as possible. As always, I used my favorite monster clay for separating the mold. This was also a 3-part mold. One big part for the front and the back was also separated in 2 parts. I brushed on several coats of Rebound 40. And then added the silicone stripes as keys for the mold shell. The shell was again made out of epoxy resin and fiberglass cloth. The stuff I use here, by the way, is called epoxy coat. I get that question all the time. It's a very thick epoxy resin. Then I made the second part of the mold, and when that was done, I did the third part. For each section I need 2 days and 2 more days to do the separation with the clay and to clean the mold after demolding. This means it took me about 8 days to make this mold. It's so relieving when you open the mold and see it was a success. When you have a very tight time schedule, it's not an option to redo it. Casting the top had to be done in one step at the same day. It was the same like the legs. It took me forever since this was such a huge mold. After many hours of brushing in the silicone, I could assemble the mold. To connect all parts, I added thickened silicone to the seams. The next morning, I could demold the top and cut off the excess material. I did not film it, but of course I also gave the whole piece a soap and water bath before I started with the painting process. Again, I started with the red details. The toothpick was my best friend here. Then I went on with the weathering and shading effects. I think at that point you know how it works. This is the crotch piece, if this is the correct wording. I made it separately because it would have made the big upper body mold more complicated. Here you can see that I added fabric to the silicone to reinforce it and prevent ripping. I actually did this with most of the parts I casted for this suit. The torso was not done yet. On top of the silicone there are some armor plates. We printed them with our resin printer, and again it was time for some sanding. Then I gave all pieces a nice paint job and added some weathering. Ralph modified the original 3D model to make the assembling easier, and now I could just click all pieces together. This looked already super nice, but the torso was not done yet. This is the middle part of the back, which will later also hide the zipper. At that point I was running out of time and did a very quick and dirty brush-on mold with a warbler shell. Since this is only a quite small one-part mold, this works fine and it saved me one day of work. I brushed in a few coats of black tinted silicone. I used dragon skin for all my silicone casts, by the way. And then I could already demold it. The back was then attached to the top with a lot of pins to get it into the right position on the fabric shirt before I could start gluing everything down. Also, the back had a few armor parts which we 3D printed with resin, sanded, and then they all got a nice weathered metallic look. I attached them to the silicone back piece and the upper body was finally coming together. The very last detail were the LEDs, and then we were finally done with the torso. Together with the neck, this looks so cool. At that point, it was definitely my favorite part of the costume. We went on working on a smaller costume part, the gloves. Gloves are always super challenging and we had to modify them to make them work for cosplay. Both hands have a different design which I really like. First we printed a few prototypes to check the fit. We always print the prototypes with PLA. The final glove was then printed with resin. Look at that, so pretty! After sanding and making sure the whole glove was super smooth, I started to work on the mold. Since it was not a super complex shape, I could do a two-part mold. I did this with both gloves, but I was running out of rebound 40 silicone and had to take rebound 25 instead. That is the reason why both hand molds have a different color. The casting process was super easy and fast since it was such a small mold. I only had to make sure the silicone goes into all the details and that I wouldn't get any air bubbles. Of course, I added some shading and weathering, and then only the fingers were missing. These were also printed with resin, which is perfect for small pieces like that. We sanded them and gave them a smooth surface with spray filler, and then I could already do my painting magic. Oh, and this wouldn't be a proper cosplay project if I would not had to sew gloves. The last step was to assemble all parts and glue everything to the fabric gloves. And here we have the finished gloves. The combination of silicone and 3D printed parts worked so well. We finally saw an end at the tunnel when we had to make the arms. They were the last big silicone pieces I had to make. Again, we sent the files over to Tiger Crafts, who printed and sanded the arms for us. For the arms, I could make a two-part mold. While I brushed on the silicone, I realized I was running out of rebound 40, so I did the rest of the mold with rebound 25, which is very similar, it just has a different color. As always, I did the epoxy and fiberglass shell. and then repeated the whole process for the other half of the mold. It took me 1 week to make both arm molds. For the demolding process, I again needed Ralph's biceps power. What would I do without him? Again, the molds turned out perfect and they looked super cool with the different colors. You all know what came then. A very, very long silicone casting day. But I knew that these were the last silicone parts I had to make, which pushed my motivation a lot. After demolding and trimming the seam line, it was time to give the arms a nice paint job. Now I just had to add the last details to the arms. Seriously, this costume has so many details. And then we were finally done with the arms. For the wig, we asked our friend Baka Cosplay to make it for us. Arthur's hairstyle is quite challenging since it was going to be a full lace wig with a hand-knotted hairline and 2 hair colors. So this was the perfect project for Baka. She took all the measurements and a few weeks later she brought us the finished wig. I think the hairstyle fits Ralph so well. The helmet is actually not part of the original Arthur outfit, but we still wanted to make it for the photo shoot and some cool transition videos. Our resin printer was not big enough to print this in one piece, so we had to separate it into 3 parts. 2 parts for the main helmet and 1 part was the backplate. Ralph also modeled and printed these small black pieces to make the assembling and gluing process easier. Then it was time for sanding and a lot of spray filler. The backplate of the helmet was attached with very small magnets. We often use magnets in all our costumes, by the way. Then came my part, painting. I first did the dark grey pattern and went on with the red details. I must say I really love this color combination. Of course, the helmet needed some weathering and shading as well. And then we were already done. Oh, and as you can see, we also added some LEDs. Looks so cool. Did I say no more mold making and casting? Well, I forgot I still had to make the butt. So we 3D printed and sanded it. And of course, it also got the texture. I'm still super happy how good this technique worked. You've seen me making so many molds and silicone castings in this video. I swear this is the last one. It was a super easy process because it was only 1 part mold. Only the casting was a bit tricky because the butt has 3 different colors. The butt piece got a nice paint job with some extra heavy weathering. I tried to make the top part look like metal. I think it looks okay. As I said, it's difficult to get the metallic finish on silicone. The main part of the costume was done now, but we still had to make the harness. For that we got help from our friend Lara. She sewed all these pockets and straps. But of course I had to make the harness fit to the rest of the costume, so all pieces had to get some weathering. And the pockets were not only empty, they were actually filled with ammo. That's what I love the most, when you have little details like this everywhere. I assembled and sewed together all straps and bags, and then we still had to make the sword. Ralph separated the sword into 5 pieces and printed it with our resin printer. When you get a 3D file from a gaming studio, the files are never made for 3D printing. Ralph always works out a plan how to separate and assemble the model for 3D printing, and I think this time he again did a very good job. After assembling, we spent some time with sanding and filling, and then I could finally give it a nice paint job. Never forget the weathering. The sword was attached to the harness with magnets, so here I'm adding these super strong magnets to the sword. The sword has this red fabric strap wrapped around the blade, so we could easily hide the magnets under it. And then we were finally done with the costume. After 3 months of intense crafting, we finished the costume just in time for tennocon. If you want to see more of our tennocon trip, make sure to check out my shorts. We are super happy and proud that we had the chance to bring Arthur to life, and everyone at tennocon and also online is loving it, which makes us really happy, and I also think it suits Ralph pretty well. Thank you so much Digital Extremes for the trust in our work. By the way, if you want to see more Warframe cosplays, make sure to check our other videos where we made the Lotus and the Dex Soldier. Also make sure to check out Warframe. It's an amazing game and it's free to play on all platforms. The link is in the video description. And now let me finally present you Arthur.